So good morning, Reshma. If you could just introduce yourself for the collective, that would be great.
So my name is Reshma Anwar, and I was born and brought up in Germany. I studied dance for my undergrad. I worked as a professional dancer in the US, and then I went on to do my master in public administration at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And after that, I've been working in Europe mostly in the public policy field. And yeah, now I'm back in Miami, and I joined the collective for this moment.
Incredible. And what led you to joining the collective?
So I've been following CPI for a while now, and then I heard about the collective, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting, and especially the topic around decolonizing development. I was focusing my studies a lot on international development, and I've implemented dance programs before in like Jamaica and Haiti. Um, so I've been also my personal journey wondering about that question about decolonizing, also the self and the body. Um, in my dance career, that question has come up a couple of times, especially in the dance space. It's actually a really big question, how to decolonize the dance space. So, yeah, I just wanted to meet people who are like-minded and who kind of like have the same question, come from it maybe from a different perspective and learn from each other.
That's so powerful. As a dancer myself, I know that there's so much integrated colonialism in all styles of dance. And so unlearning that by using dance as a vehicle itself for itself decolonization is really, really fascinating, which is very different than the structure of exploration that we did in the collective, which is not dance. We chatted every couple of weeks. But as you brought those questions into the space, how are you able to explore these questions that were important to you, but within the collective?
So I feel like within the collective, the discussion points and the way we navigated through the journey together led me to start unlayering my thoughts. And that unlayering of thoughts ultimately led me to a certain learning inquiry, how we call it, um, to come at it maybe from a different perspective. Because before I thought it all needs to be it all needs to start up here with the system. And I'm like, well, but what if we start from ourselves? What if we start decolonizing our own ideas and how we're brought up? Because I have parents from an immigrant background, but I was born and brought up in the Western world. So I was brought up with a lot of colonized ideas, I would say. Even in dance, I I was very focused on studying technique, which is ballet technique, which is a Western idea of technique. Um, so I was like, well, what if we decolonize the body and the mind first, and from these kind of imposed structures and ideas? And what if that could lead to ultimately a bigger change? So yeah, that's how I kind of got there.
That's so powerful and so beautiful. And knowing a little bit about your experiment, and so it's so inspiring to see that journey from question to now experiment. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about then. So you had this question, what did you do with it? You developed an experiment. Can you tell me a little bit more about the experiment and what it was like to run the experiment?
Yes. So then I decided to create an experiment to see what happens. So I ended up being in Germany for an extended time, and I saw some things in in society that I have seen from years ago, and I was like, why haven't these things changed? So, you know, now with an increased number of refugees and asylum seekers, it's very evident that there's a certain cultural barrier that is clearly visible when you look at people on the streets or in the tram. And I feel like there's this societal, cultural, societal disconnect. And I was like, what could help to socially integrate uh, the new people into the society, and what could lead to make what could have or what could make everyone more comfortable in the space that we're all sharing together. So I created a movement experiment. I've been hosting movement workshops before, but I was like, well, what if this could be an experiment? So I brought together a group of people. Um, some of them were Germans, some of them were Syrians, some of them were second generation immigrants. So a very diverse group of people, not only from heritage, but also age-wise. So there were people from the 50s and up, there were younger generations in their 20s, and then there were also children who were 9 and 10 years old. So that was definitely a challenge. But I was like, well, let's see what happens. So I created an experiment with movement structures to see how we move in society. So I started with walking patterns, see how people, to have people first ground themselves, to have people feel themselves within the space. And then I started to open the awareness of the people. It's like, well, now look around. And then I started to guide them to start seeing each other. How is it to see each other and to purposefully look into the eyes of another person? And then that led ultimately into an exercise I called mirroring exercise. And there it was about how can we empathize with each other? How can we follow each other's movements? But also, it was interesting to observe who was starting, how did people communicate non-verbally, who took leadership, who who took themselves back, how who was more comfortable, um, and then from there, um, I did an exercise called flocking. So there it was more about group dynamics and how people work with each other in a group, and also here was a question of leadership and who takes initiative to change direction. How can we change direction together? But not like I'm the leader and everyone follows me in a line, which actually happened, and I had to like guide them out of that. But how can we, a tight group of people walking together, changing direction, following each other, but also helping each other? And then the last exercise was about creating an image together. But there was interesting to see who was the first person to start. Was it always the same person? Did people also give the space to other people to start? Because there was no right and wrong answer. And with the experiment, it was interesting because I do make it seem every time like the exercise matters. Like it's all about getting the exercise correctly. But it wasn't about that. It was about the process. And that was my observation, like what happens in the in-between moments. Um, so yeah, that was very interesting. And then with that, I also created a survey, and it was very interesting to see what people said before and after the experiment. So there was a pre and a post survey, and there were questions around if they have interacted with people from other cultural and ethnic backgrounds before, and what their comfort level is. And yeah, and people were very, I would say they over and underestimated themselves a lot before. And then after they realized, well, I actually didn't feel that comfortable. Or they also said, well, I actually felt like, wow, I can do way more than I thought. So yeah, definitely had an impact on them.
Yeah, and you put so much in your so much of your learnings in your report as well. But I'd love for you to speak a little bit to that original question that you came at of what does it mean to decolonize the self and the body? This workshop that you did in this really diverse space with different sorts of people around community, around belonging and identity. What did that teach you? What did this experiment teach you about the original question that you were asking?
Yes, so I thought, well, what if we release those imposed structures and ideas, right? Because I didn't really put on a structure. I just guided them through an experience. So it was on the participant to see how they interpret my guidance. And it was interesting because I came from a very, okay, from like a, I would say, meditative standpoint. So we were all equal in that space from my point of view. Um, but yet we were in a certain context. We were still in Germany, in a space where there were majority Germans in that space. So I did see some behaviors that led to the people who were in the minority kind of like undermine themselves. So they were less likely to take on leadership. They were, however, more likely to find solutions to problems non-verbally. Um, but I also found it interesting that my guidance was taken on by Germans as a structure and a system. So then it was the Germans who mostly wanted to bring clarity. So, for example, one of the older male Germans stopped the whole experiment and wanted to say, okay, this needs to done this way in order for it to work. And then everyone had to follow. And I was just there as a guide and I just let it happen because I wanted to see what happens. So then after the experiment, I was like, well, we are, even though I tried to create the space as a neutral space, it wasn't neutral. So there is still an imposed structure in there because of the context we're in. So maybe now I'm dealing with the question, maybe it isn't the body and the self that needs to be decolonized first. I think it's part of the process, but maybe it's not the first step. Maybe it is the system. Because how else can we find that agency or that empowerment of those who feel like they need to obey? So yeah, that's what I'm questioning now. And again, I may be wrong again, and maybe there's even a whole other answer, but that's where I want to ultimately the experiment to lead to. Because right now I feel like the last experiment was more of a pilot project and to see what happens. And now I'm also in a whole different context of, well, what would happen if we take this into a Miami context? There's a lot of cultural diversity here, but it's a whole different story here. So yeah, so that's the question that I'm working on right now.
Yeah, the evolution of that question is what I was going to ask about next, of how what you're taking from one learning is inspiring or informing how you want to move forward. But you already seem to answer that. And it's the hypotheses that you're coming across and what you're learning also just show the messiness of this work and how there is not a straightforward answer. This broad conversation and this broad topic of decolonization doesn't have a checklist that you can come and do, like, if on the self level you do these things and at the systems level you do these things, congratulations, you've decolonized. Like, that's not the way that it goes. It's actually so much more interconnected and complex and dynamic. And so what your experiments are showing is that the messiness, the process part of it, not the outcome, as you mentioned, the process is so much more important, but that process requires so much unlearning and the right structures to be doing it in. Um, is there anything else that you want to add? I don't have any other questions for you.
Well, I definitely think like unlearning is such a big word because I feel like we come from such a like learned behavior because that's what I saw with my experiment too with the children. They were so open to receive and they were so open to what was going on around them. And they were the ones being finding solutions the fastest and actually being very involved in the process. So, and versus the adults who had like such a big like they have history and they have so many learned behaviors, so they reacted in a whole different way.
Totally. And I feel that in my own myself when I try to unlearn things from childhood, but there's something about the structure in which we live that beats into us a type
Mhm.
of learning, but not the malleability that's necessary to adapt to life, you know?